My name is Nobbe. Today's date is Saturday, March 30th, 2019. I'm interviewing Rachel Popma on the Ball State campus as part of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. Thank you, Rachel, for agreeing to participate in this effort, which we're conducting during the Honors College's 60th anniversary year. I'd like to begin by asking you where and when you were born.
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, May 9th, 1975.
And who are your parents?
My parents are Chris Popma and Judy Torrance.
And what was your childhood like?
I grew up, I was born in Chicago, but when my parents were kind of hippie back to the Landers in the 70s. So it wasn't too long before we ended up in an old farmhouse out in the suburbs of Chicago, kind of where I used to say it was where the suburbs turned to corn. You know, you drive 15 minutes and you're at the mall, but I grew up and went to a very rural high school, kind of out in the middle of nowhere sort of deal. So, and the whole back to the land thing didn't work out too well, but I went to a small rural high school in Peatone, Illinois. So it was about 15 minutes or so from where we actually lived. So I spent a lot of time on a bus as a kid. And it was a very small high school. I had 90 some students in my graduating class. So coming to Ball State was a pretty big change in that way.
What was your family life like?
My parents divorced when I was, I think, in 4th or 5th grade. So my dad stayed kind of out at the farm, and my mom moved kind of back into the suburbs. So we split our time. My brother and I split our time between them, as you know, it happens a lot in divorced families. And my mom remarried in I think it was 1988. Yeah, and my dad remarried in 2001. So I eventually ended up with a bunch of step siblings and a half sibling, and kind of a big old blended family. Also not too unusual these days. So. Yeah.
So where you went to school, was that with your mom or with your dad?
That's where my dad was.
Okay.
Yeah. So we stayed kind of out there with what we've been familiar with, right? So it was the kind of place where, they have 3 elementary schools in a district that all feed into one middle school and one junior or one high school. So you go to school with the same kids pretty much from like 1st grade all the way through. So.
Did you like that dynamic?
Yes and no. I think as an adult, I see its positives probably more than I did by the time I was 17 or 18 and was ready for change, but I feel like I still had quite a lot of opportunity for being at a school that was relatively small. So I still got to do theater and music and all kinds of things that I was interested in. That's not always the case with those rural schools. So it had its good points and its bad points, I think.
Did you have siblings besides your step siblings?
I do, yeah. I have a younger brother, and then I have a much younger half sister. And then I have several step siblings on each side. So. Okay.
And then as you kind of moved into high school, what was that experience like for you?
Well, as I said, it was very small, and you went to school with all the same kids. So, it wasn't much of a transition, I think, like it sometimes can be for kids who are moving from elementary school to junior high or junior high to high school, where you're dealing with a much larger group of people and just lots more to have to think about and deal with. So it wasn't much of a transition in that way. But I was a band geek. Although I didn't really realize just how big like band was until I came here. I remember very clearly going back to my band director like my freshman year of college and being like, "Man, marching band's really big in Indiana." And he just looked at me like I'd grown another head, like, "Duh. Course," because we had like 35 kids in our band. It wasn't nearly like they've got in other places. So I did band, I did theater, I was on the yearbook staff, I was in the school newspaper, all that kind of stuff. So I stay busy.
Did you have a good group of friends you stuck around with?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some of who I'd been friends with since I was, little, and then a few that I made in junior high. There's kind of a town kid versus country kid dynamic there for a while too. But I still talk to some of them, and some of my friends actually have a son who's a Ball State student right now, which is a little difficult for me to realize that I'm old enough for that to be the case. Yeah.
Did you have certain classes that you liked a lot?
English. I loved reading. I also really liked history. I didn't really like math or science, although I was pretty good at it. I'd much rather read a book.
Yeah. I'm with you there. And then, as you got along through your high school time, when did you start looking at college?
That's a good question. I think probably about the year that you usually do, kind of junior year of college, or of high school, I mean. I remember it was a difficult process for me, only because my family didn't have a lot of money. There was definitely concern about how we were going to pay for it and what kind of school I wanted to be at. I was a pretty smart kid. I was high school valedictorian, so there were lots of colleges. Back in the day when you used to get mail, right? They used to send you all kinds of stuff. And most of it just seemed really out of reach. Maybe not so much financially, but just so different from what I was used to, thinking about like the University of Chicago, for example. It just seemed that's not something I could ever do, So I probably didn't look very far, I think, when I was looking at colleges. I wasn't thinking about like going to California or going to the East Coast or something like kids do. I kind of wanted to stay pretty close to home.
I'm going to take it back real quick here. Can you elaborate on what the aspect was between town kids and your rural kids?
Sure. Well, not only did I grow up, went to, as I said, a fairly small high school, but it just families had lived there for, hundreds of years in some cases. Well, maybe not hundreds, 100 years, we'll say. And there was very definitely like the farm kids, who lived out in the country. And then there was the town kids who lived in town and didn't have a farm. Although many times they were also related to some of the farm kids, but the town had its own elementary school. So like if you lived in town, you went to elementary school in town. If you lived out in the country, you went to one of the other two elementary schools. So we were split kind of that way. And coming into junior high, it was very much like, oh, you live out in the country, right? Or you live in town. You don't have to worry about being snowed into your house because you live in town and they have snow plows, that kind of thing. But from a practical standpoint, it meant things like when I had to stay after school for an after school activity when I was in junior high or high school before I was driving. Like I had to go hang out at the public library till 6 o'clock or whenever my dad got off work and come out to town to get us and take us back. So
what did your dad do?
Right now, well, my dad is retired now. At the time, he was in the process of changing careers. He started out as he was also an English major in college. And then one of those English majors, what are you going to do with it? Well, he went into, he did construction work for a long time. He had his own business installing in-ground pools. So he did that for many years. And then once my parents got divorced, he decided he needed something a little bit more steady. He tried HVAC kind of servicing for a while, and then actually went back to school and studied computer programming. And so he had a career kind of from then on as a programmer, and then as a IT project manager and things like that by the time he retired. So he was in the process kind of training for that new career, which back in the late 80s was kind of like, that's the next hot thing, right?
Did your mom work as well?
She's a registered nurse.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you talked about with the elementary schools being separated. Did you guys kind of stick together with your rural elementary school?
I think initially we did, but once you get into, really into high school, but it happens a little bit in junior high too, but especially once you get into high school, all of your social circles reconfigure, right? Kind of based on what you're interested in doing and things like that. So.
As you went along, did any of your town friends was there a weird dynamic there still?
Not so much. Not so much. I think eventually it kind of worked out, But it's a lot easier to be in town and go to the football game than it is to live, 20 minutes outside of town and go to the football game, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Once you decided to keep moving on in high school, when did you start looking at Ball State?
So that is an interesting story. Ball State, the Honors College used to have, and I don't know that it still does, a summer program for high school students where basically you would come in as a high school student, usually the summer before your senior year, and take a college class. And they had a very well respected kind of architecture experience program tied in with that. So a lot of the kids who came to do that wanted to be architects. I didn't want to be an architect, but they did have a psychology class that you could take, which is kind of a nice gen ed deal. And I think they probably sent me a thing in the mail along with all the other college mail that you tend to get. And I, in high school, had a summer camp scholarship from, I think it was the Rotary maybe, or the Chamber of Commerce, something like that in the town that I grew up in. And so they would pay part of your tuition for a summer camp. Well, the one year before I had gone to flute camp, if you can believe that, at the University of Illinois. Learned pretty quickly I can't compete at flute camp. Didn't really want to go through that again. So I thought, well, maybe, I like school. This would be kind of fun. You get to go, you live in a dorm, you spend a week on a college campus, nobody knows me there, might be interesting. So Ball State's recruiting tool in that way was very effective. And so I went through that program, had a great time, met the girl who would eventually be my freshman year roommate when I got to Ball State. And then so when I came back from that, I was pretty interested in applying to Ball State for school. So it wasn't the only college I ended up applying to or visiting, but it was definitely probably top on my list after that experience.
Did anything else make it stick out to you?
I liked that it was big, but not too big. Growing up in Illinois and being a student who was, academically inclined, let's say, they really, like my college counselor and everything in high school, was like, well, you should think about the University of Illinois, or obviously you're an Illinois resident, it's cheaper to go to in-state schools, so you could think about those. But when I visited the University of Illinois, and my dad was a graduate, so I was kind of an alumni kid, it was so big. The campus was just so huge and there were so many people. It just seemed really overwhelming to me. But at the same time, I knew I didn't want to go to a tiny little liberal arts college because it was going to be kind of like high school to me in that way. I visited some of them, was very interested in a few of them, but ultimately was like, well, I'm going to be in a town in a cornfield. And Muncie, I guess, is a bigger town in a cornfield, to think about it that way. But it was attractive to me because it was bigger. It offered me kind of the chance to be anonymous in a way. But at the same time, knowing that I had the Honors College, which was a much kind of smaller group within the bigger group, made me feel like I would have a little bit of a home in such a big place. So that was very attractive to me.
How did it attract you financially?
Well, I applied for and received the Whitinger Scholarship. So once I found that out, it was pretty much a done deal. Yeah.
What was that process like?
Oh, gosh. As I recall, you had to do a pretty standard application. I think there were probably teacher recommendations and so forth involved. I had to write an autobiography. Yeah, I remember this very specifically because I'm 17 years old or whatever. What kind of story do I have, right? I'm probably going back at it now, I would be completely horrified at whatever I came up with. But I remember I had to take the day off of school because I had procrastinated doing it. And my dad was like, it's fine, but just finish it. And I did this very elaborate collage back when you actually had to cut up photos, like a cover, wrote the autobiography, and you send it off. And then they pick people for interviews. And then I came to campus and interviewed with Dr. Wittig at that point. And then you sat by your mailbox and waited because there wasn't any email then. So yeah, it was a little bit of a nerve-wracking experience that way.
What was your interview like? Do you remember?
I remember being very nervous. I remember wearing a blazer, very 1992. And I actually remember the interview itself being really comfortable. Once I finally got in there and started talking with Dr. Wittig, it didn't seem so intimidating. I don't really remember the details of the interview. It's been a while. But I remember feeling very positive about the process. Sometimes you go into those situations, you can kind of tell if it's gone well or not. I remember feeling positive about it. But, going home, I knew they also only pick 10 a year. So that's a lot of competition.
But obviously it worked out for you.
It worked out. Yeah, it worked out. And I got the letter in the mail, and I had to go down the gravel driveway to the mailbox. And I got the letter and I opened it in the driveway, and there was a lot of yelling. I was very happy. Yeah.
Were your parents really happy too?
I think they were really happy. Yeah. My parents I remember them being a little bit hands off about the whole thing. Maybe they weren't as much as I'm remembering. But I think that they wanted me to pick something that was going to be right for me. So there wasn't a lot of pressure to go to one kind of school or go to a particular school. Although I know my mom was really impressed by the fact that, Harvard was sending me letters and that kind of thing. 'Cause, it was impressive back then. But I think they were relieved too. It takes a lot of concern out of it if it's going to be paid for. That's reassuring. Now that I'm a parent and I'm looking at having 2 kids, so I'm going to have to send to school. It's like, that would be really nice.
That'll make any parent
That'd
happy.
be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you mentioned earlier that you graduated valedictorian.
I did from high school, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Were you proud of that?
I was proud and I was embarrassed. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, when you have such a small school and, such a small group of people, I think all that kind of social stuff is amplified a little bit. So it was like, I was never really, I don't know, I guess being smart in that way was often more embarrassing for me than like something to be proud of. It wasn't really till I got to Ball State and kind of grew up, I think, that I could look back on that as being a positive thing and something to be proud of doing, and not something to kind of be like, oh, what a nerd. Right.
Do you feel like that was an atmosphere around you from just your high school experience, or was that just something that you thought in your head?
Oh, probably both. You know what kids are like. So, now I'm like, whatever. But everything is amplified when you're, 16, 17, 20, right? Everything seems much more important and dramatic in a lot of ways.
And then were you excited to go to Ball State finally?
I was. The nice thing about Ball State also was about 4 hours drive from my home. So it was like just far enough away that I could get home if I really had to or wanted to, but not close enough that my parents would like just show up. They would never actually do that. But in my head, I thought, that's great. They can't just like decide to drive, Whereas if I had been in Champaign at the University of Illinois, that was an hour and a half from where my parents live. Like, theoretically, they could just show up at my door. So I liked the distance. It was far, but not too far, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was it like when you finally showed up?
I remember it being really weird because my dad drove me down and my mom and my stepdad drove separately because they had like all my stuff. Not everybody had like a minivan and stuff back then. And so having like both sides of my family there at the same time was a little odd. And then just the whole situation is weird. You know, you're coming into a place that's really foreign and you don't know what to expect and you're not sure how to act and everybody's kind of a stranger. And that's all heightened by the fact you're leaving your family and you're kind of like, please go away, but I don't want you to leave right yet. You know, you don't want to say that. So I remember it being kind of weird and awkward initially. And it was very, after that first day, after you move in and everything, but before classes start, it was really strange to realize that I could do pretty much whenever I wanted, whenever I wanted to. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, so that was really freeing. Yeah.
So you adapted well to getting to be on your own?
I think so, although I never understood, I don't know, like my roommate and I were both like, why are you just like taking a shower at 10 o'clock at night? Where are you going? You know, we're like, we're going to bed. I don't know what you're up to. So it was nice to be with friends who were going through the same kinds of things that I was. It was nice to bond in that way, but certainly going from having your schedule so regimented in high school, right? Bells ring and then you move somewhere and then you get to a college campus and yeah, theoretically you're supposed to be at class at 9 o'clock or whatever. Maybe you'll be at class at 9 o'clock. I was kind of a good girl, so I would usually go to class. There were some exceptions later on. But just figuring out how to manage your time, especially initially because I wasn't working. I was just going to class. Figuring out what to do with all that time took some getting used to. Yeah.
You mentioned it's talking about your roommate again. Did
Yeah.
you guys stay close throughout college?
I think so. I'm still in touch with her. She lives in Louisville. She's from Louisville. We didn't live together after that first year because I went overseas for a semester. So she moved in with some other friends of ours, and then we weren't in the same major or anything. So we kind of went our separate ways a little bit, but we still stayed in touch. Yeah.
And what dorm did you live in?
I lived in Schmidt-Wilson. Actually, I think is it the Wilson part? That's the top part. Do you know?
I couldn't tell
It was
you.
like the 7th floor, I think. I think Wilson is on top.
And then what was your freshman class experience like?
Gosh. I'm trying to remember what I took freshman year. I was going to say one thing about the dorm. You could still smoke in the dorm back then, right? They had certain floors where you could still do that. I think it was while I was there that they kind of got rid of that, but that's how long ago it was. Freshman class. I remember it being, I was taking the first classes in the humanities series, and I had just mostly some gen ed classes. I remember taking a philosophy class in the spring, and that had a lot of honors students in it. I remember taking a Western Civ class. I think it was, I don't know what the number is, one of the 100 level Western Civ classes that's like the beginning of time to the Renaissance or however many thousands of years. And I couldn't stand that class because, number one, it wasn't an honors class. So let's just say the level of motivation among your classmates varied quite a bit. But it just seems so stupid to take like 2,000 years of history or whatever and put it into like a class. It was like everything was multiple choice and everything was really broad. And as somebody who liked history, I was very dissatisfied with that whole experience. Although, later once I was teaching as a college instructor, I came to see, let's say, gen ed classes a little differently. But that was not a good experience. Trying to remember what else I did. I also got involved with the university chorus my freshman year, which wasn't a class per se, but that was one of the other things that I did. And doing that and taking private flute lessons, which I'd never had the chance to do before then, was kind of how I got involved with the music department that year, even though that ultimately wouldn't be something I majored in.
With that first freshman honor class, what do you remember about it?
Dr. Ranieri was my professor, and I love Dr. Ranieri. It was interesting to me because although I'd read some of the things that we read in those first couple of semesters, you start with the Greeks and the Romans and all that kind of stuff, the ancient stuff. It was thinking about it in a much different way. I think you were both learning to kind of think more deeply and more broadly. So you're looking at texts kind of more deeply than you probably had in high school, but you're also thinking much more about broader connections to things, to other texts, to other times, to other experiences. So it was really broadening for me in that way that, say, Western civilization class was not, even though it overlapped a little bit in subject matter.
Do you feel like that was a much higher level, or do you feel like it was just much more like wide scope?
I don't remember feeling like it was hard, right? I mean, I didn't see it kind of as an academic challenge so much as I appreciated the way that encouraged me to think differently. I don't know that I'd had that kind of experience in high school, although I had some really great teachers in high school. It's a different, the way that you learn to think about things is different when you get into a college classroom.
Were there any other honors professors through your time here that had a big impact on you?
Well, I did manage to finish the humanities sequence with Dr. Ranieri. I actually did the third semester of that as an independent study because I was in England. And so we did a lot of stuff by email, which was interesting. Back when email wasn't fast and there wasn't Wi-Fi. And then I'm trying to think who else. Oh, my freshman year I took Tony Edmonds's, I forget what the class was. I think it was 199, maybe. It was an American family and history class, and I love Dr. Edmonds. I love both of the Drs. Edmonds. That was a great class. Trying to think what else. I don't know that anything else about like the specific honors, the required honors classes stands out to me so much. Some of the honors colloquia that I took were interesting in that way. I took a class on American immigrant literature with Matt Fisher, who's one of my favorite professors in the English department. And I took a Latin American women writers class that was in Spanish. I used to know a lot of Spanish. I don't anymore. And that was a great class because that led to something that I did with my honors thesis. So that was a great experience for me also. I did a class that was actually taught by honors students, I think who had done a fellowship maybe about putting together a class. It was about Irish literature. That was very interesting. So having the chance to do that deeper study of something that you probably wouldn't get in the regular required classes was always really interesting to me.
Were you in any honors organizations?
I was in the Student Honors Council.
What was that like?
I remember when we had one fellow council member who was very upset that we were not really good about following the Roberts Rules of Order. So I would say it was kind of informal, but we really liked the opportunity to plan things for other honors students. So thinking about, as students, having the chance to kind of anticipate what other students wanted and needed in terms of, social events or other kinds of programs was really interesting. And then we also got to go to, there's actually an organization, or there used to be, of student honors councils, and they would have a big conference every year, National Collegiate Honors Council. So we got to go to that a couple of times, and that was always fun.
Were you on the board at any time, or was it just a member?
I was on the board,
okay.
Although I don't remember now what I was exactly. Yeah.
And then, as you were Whiting Scholar,
Yeah.
were you guys a close group?
Yes and no. We didn't get together very often as a group during the school year. We had a Weiner Scholar banquet once a year where everybody got together, and I believe it was the senior class, would choose a banquet speaker. So it was usually an honors professor that class had particularly liked. And then, I had individual friendships with some folks who also happened to be Weidinger scholars, but in terms of interest in major, and we were pretty spread out, so we just didn't see each other all that often as a group.
How much time do you spend with Dr. Wittig?
And I knew him fairly well, but he retired, I believe, as dean during the time that I was at Ball State. So he was only the dean, I think, for a couple of years while I was here. So I did work with him during freshman orientation, because there were a couple of summers when I worked as the assistant for the honors orientation. So they do a session at freshman orientation. The Honors College would do a session at freshman orientation for incoming honors students. So I was kind of the student assistant for that program, and there were a couple of summers. I can't remember now if it was both of them or just one of them, but Dr. Wittig was there, and so we'd give a presentation to incoming honors students and their parents, and then I had some time where I would just meet with the incoming freshmen on their own and that kind of thing. So I did work kind of closely with him at least one summer early on.
Do you remember what he was like?
I have a positive impression of him. He had these glasses that he wore. I do remember, I was just thinking about this, I do remember my Weidinger interview with him. We ended up singing a song together. Of all things, I think it was a Bryan Adams song. I don't even know how that came up or why it happened. But so I would certainly say that he was willing to kind of joke with students a little bit, but I didn't know him as well as I knew later deans. Yeah.
And then later deans, do you mean Dr. Bruce Meyer?
Yeah.
Okay. What was your relationship with him?
Dr. Meyer was the one who told me I should not be a historic preservationist. I don't know that I've ever forgiven him for that. Actually. I know he's passed and I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but I will never forget that. And which is funny because he was an architecture professor, right? He was pretty charming, I would say. Really engaged with students, and during the year that he was dean, I was also working in the Honors College office off and on various projects, so I saw him quite a bit. And he was genuinely interested in getting to know students and in kind of invigorating the Honors College a little bit socially, because up to that point, outside of Student Honors Council, they didn't really do much that wasn't academic for students, and I think he saw an opportunity there to maybe do some other things that would be interesting and give students a chance to interact outside of a dorm, right? Because not everybody lives in the dorm forever. So I remember that about him. He tried to dance with me at the Honors College ball. He was a much better dancer than I was at 20, or even now, probably. And it was really sad when he died. That was a shock. I was working in the Honors College that summer, and it was really difficult for those of us who worked with him.
You feel like it hit the Honors College hard?
I think so, because it was a surprise. Like you don't expect that, and he was still fairly new at the job too. So I think there was that sense of, well, we got some stuff started, and now where are we going?
And then you talked about studying abroad a few times.
I did.
Do you want to talk about that?
I could talk about that for hours.
You might not have that long.
Okay, well, what do you want to know?
Where did you go first?
Where did I go first? Okay, so I had not been on campus very long, like less than 6 months, when they were promoting, the Honors College was promoting its study abroad exchange program with Westminster College. So at the time, they had a program with Westminster College, which was a independent kind of teachers college, I think it was, outside of Oxford. It was not at that time an Oxford college, so it's not like their students were Oxford University students. They could go to lectures and things there, but it was a self-contained institution. And the Honors College would send over a group of students, usually 10 or 12 Ball State students, with a professor, and you would do a combination of classes at Westminster with Westminster faculty, and then whoever the Ball State faculty member was, you usually took a class or two with that person also. And they had some travel built in. And for me, I had always wanted to go overseas, and England specifically. So when they said, came up with this program, I was like, I know I've only been here for a second, but I think I want to go do that. Not everybody goes overseas as a sophomore, right? It's more of a junior kind of thing. But it also helps that I had some friends who were going on that trip also. So again, I would not be totally with a bunch of strangers. That was nice.
What semester was that?
That
was your fall?
That was the fall semester that would have been fall of 94. Yeah. And so we went, our professor was Deanne Burkle. She was actually a physical education professor. So there was a lot of yoga and a lot of hummus, which was very strange for 1994. We always thought she was a little weird. And now every time I feed my kid hummus, I'm like, I got to tell you, Deanne, I got to go back to her and be like, she was ahead of her time in many ways. Her daughter actually lived in Ireland. And so the first 2 weeks before our Westminster semester started, she and her husband, who were leading our group, took us around Ireland. We spent 2 weeks just going around, to all the Irish stuff. And it was August, but it was extremely damp and very cold compared to August in Muncie. So it was a little bit of a culture shock right away. And then once we got to Westminster, I took a class in Victorian literature from the Westminster faculty member, which meant that I spent the whole summer before reading extremely large novels. Yeah.
Was that entire semester? Did you have a really good experience with that then?
Yeah, it was. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about limits, let's say. The drinking age over there is 18. And I would be remiss in not mentioning that was a limit that I learned about while I was over there. But the thing about England specifically is that it's familiar because they speak English, right? But there's just enough that's different and unusual that for somebody who'd never really been anywhere before, culturally, it had a really significant impact. It was just kind of seeing where you came from a different perspective, and seeing how you are seen by other people was pretty eye-opening at 19. I was not the same person when I came back. I mean, it was a good thing, but I don't think when I signed up to go over that was. I was anticipating that. I was like, yay, England, Ireland, there's old stuff there, and I'll read books. It'll be great, and then you come back thinking and seeing things differently, for sure.
Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Part of it is just realizing that the world doesn't revolve around you, whether that's you individually or you like an American, right? That I think it's easy in the United States because we're such a big country and we wield such a big presence, right? You can live here your whole life and never have to worry or think about like Europe or Canada even, right? So, you go over there, and the news is all, the news is like about Europe and England and what's going on over here and how that affects this. And it's just a whole different, like, oh yeah, the US is over there somewhere doing something, right? So I don't know how to really explain it other than to say it was good to realize you weren't the center of things, and that it's probably a good thing that you weren't the center of things, that being aware of what was going on elsewhere and what was important elsewhere is important. Yeah.
Was it strange going back to normal Ball State classes after that?
It was weird, yeah. Because the way the classes worked over there was, I think we met twice a week, maybe, and that was a lot because it was kind of a double class. All the books are 800 pages. It takes a while to talk about them. And so we met like Tuesday and Wednesday or something. It wasn't even like Tuesday, Thursday, like we would expect. And you'd go in and you'd talk for, 45 minutes, and then everybody would like get up and go have tea. And then they come back and they talk some more, for another 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it was. So in terms of sitting down and talking about books, that was not really any different. What they expected from essay writing was pretty different, and just the fact that you like get up and have a tea break in the middle of class and then come back, that was different too. We didn't do that in 50 minutes here. Yeah.
And then when did you go overseas again?
I did, yeah. I liked England a lot, and after all, you have to remember it was basically paid for, right? So having a Weidinger scholarship also supported my study abroad program. So I ended up being responsible for additional cost, but the basic concern about tuition and food and all that was covered. So I just really loved Oxford, where we were, and wanted the chance to go back and do more. And in the interim, the Honors College had developed an association with Harris Manchester College, which is became one of the Oxford colleges. It was a little weird because the Harris Manchester was the Oxford College for what we would call non-traditional students. So undergraduates, I think, had to be over 21 maybe, or maybe 23. I must have been 21. So not a traditional college age student, although when I went over there, I was already 21, so they were kind of contemporaries in a lot of ways. And that program was supported through an additional scholarship to Ball State students, and they sent 3 students a year, Ball State did, over to study at Harris Manchester. And rather than sending one student for the whole year, for all 3 Oxford terms, they would send one student, I think, one term, and then 2 students for one of the other terms. So we were just there for 8 weeks, the length of the Oxford term, which was pretty intimidating. There was no downtime. You get there, it's like, hey, go. But it also gave you a chance to work in the Oxford tutorial system, which is significantly different from the way that Ball State, just American colleges usually teach. So it's you, maybe one other person, once a week, basically in a meeting with your professor, and you have a topic. Sometimes you're given specific reading. Sometimes they're just like, hey, go think about this. And you have to write an essay every week. And so I took a class in 20th century, it's not even a class, a tutorial in 20th century British literature, and another one in the history of Oxford, which was kind of like the easy class that they did for the study abroad students. It wasn't easy, but like actual historians at Oxford weren't taking a class on the history of Oxford. But that one was really fun because my professor would take us around, and we would do walkabouts. So she's this little old lady, and she'd like walk you around and be like, there's, that building was built in 15 whatever, and let's go look at the History of Science Museum and talk about, columns. And so you learned a lot about history, British history, through kind of your built environment in Oxford. So that was really cool and very interesting to me as somebody who's interested in old buildings and old stuff. In addition to being pretty rigorous historically. I was not a historian. I would not have called myself a historian then. So to go do research and write history papers was kind of weird for me, because in all the history classes I'd taken at Ball State to that point, which weren't a ton, but I'd kind of been able to get away with writing as much of an English paper in a history class as you could do. So it was a challenging experience for me intellectually. Yeah, it was a big adjustment. Even though at that point I was a senior, and so you think I'd have a clue kind of about how to study and how to write about things, but there was an adjustment.
And what term was that? What semester?
That would have been spring of '97. The other thing that was weird about that is the Oxford spring term starts in April and runs through June. So I actually did the first part, or really most of, a Ball State semester, took incompletes in the classes that I had, and then went overseas and did, I think I got some kind of credit, kind of retroactively for the coursework that I did there, but I also had to be finishing up classes that I was taking here in Muncie, which didn't happen as fast. How long do you get to finish an incomplete? It didn't happen as fast as it should have.
Going after that second time, did you feel like you felt a lot more knowing about yourself than after the first time you'd been?
That time was a lot more intense, partially because of the academic experience was so much more rigorous than what I had been used to. I was dealing with a lot of dramatic personal things going into that I won't go into, but you also made friends really quickly, because there was a group of other Americans there who were doing junior year abroad programs from other schools, some in California, some in Maine, so they were from all over the country, and you kind of by default fell in with, oh, you're an American, and they sort of show you the ropes because they've been there the whole year, but you make friends really quickly in that kind of environment, and so everything felt a little bit more intense, I think, there. But there was also the sense when I was leaving that time that I wasn't going to be able to come back. When I left in 1994, it was like, oh, England's cool. I can figure out another way to get back here, right? And then as a senior, I realized, well, I'm probably not. I'm probably going to have to go have a real life. After this, I'm not going to be able to stay in Oxford forever. Yeah.
And in terms of other classes besides honors classes and abroad classes, what were those classes like?
Oh gosh, so at one point I had 4 minors. Yeah, I had 4 actual declared minors. I didn't finish all of them.
Which ones were they?
They were flute performance. Well, the reason I declared that was because I wanted to keep taking private lessons, and they pretty much at one point were like, look, even if you're just like want to play the flute, we don't have the staff to accommodate that. So if you want to keep doing that, you need to actually declare a minor so that we can justify teaching you. And my instructor was a graduate student, and she was like, I really want to keep working with you because it's fun, but you're going to have to jump through this hoop. I think I dropped it at the last, whenever you have to drop things before you graduate because you're not going to finish them. So it was like the last possible second I had to drop that minor. But I did go through a bunch of the music classes that were required for that, music history. They have a jury kind of thing that you have to, a test basically that you have to take to prove that you're learning the stuff that you're supposed to be learning as a flute performance minor. So I did those. And I did some ensemble work too through that. And that was all stuff I was doing for fun, and because I enjoyed it, and not because I thought I was going to make a career out of flute performance. No, not going to happen. So I had flute performance. I had Spanish, which I did finish. I had history, which I also finished. I realized too late I should have been a history English double major. Ran out of time. And I forget what the 4th one was. I think it was, they used to have it's like a humanities or global studies or something minor like that. And again, it was just, well, I have to graduate at some point and leave, so we could get the Spanish and history done. Didn't quite get through the other two. So I took a bunch of classes outside the English department in history and in Spanish, and in the music school, basically.
What were your English classes like?
I loved my English classes. And once I got into graduate school at a much larger university that had a different kind of undergraduate program, I realized how fortunate I was to have had the undergraduate experience that I had in the English department, because I never had a TA. You know, all of my classes from, you know, English Literature 100 or whatever it was, all the way up, were taught by professors. Having been a TA, I like to say that TAs can be pretty good at what they do, but if you're going to be a major in a subject, honestly, nothing beats having that education with somebody who's, you know, that's what they do. They're scholars in that. They do that all the time, and they have a lot more teaching experience than some of the TAs. I want to go back to my first few classes in grad school and apologize. I'm really sorry. So what I loved about them was that they were all small, you know, 20, 25 students. And, you know, you read books and talked about them, and that was really great. So,
Going back to your minor classes a little bit, what made you stick with music performance or flute performance as long as you did?
Primarily so that I could stay in the flute lessons. I'll be totally upfront about that. And I will say that I had mentioned that I was a band geek in high school. You know, I played the flute. But we never had the kind of resources growing up to pay for stuff like private lessons or, you know, all that kind of stuff that kids who are really interested in music may want to do. So when I got here and, you know, the music department would give lessons to people, I was like, cool, yeah, I totally want to do that. So it was really just so I could keep doing that. I didn't need to do it to be in the concert band, or I don't even think I needed to do it to be in the flute choir, but maybe I did. But to have those additional experiences, you know, I loved music and I wanted to be involved with it, but I knew that I wasn't probably good enough to major in it, and I didn't really want to major in it. I wasn't going to go on and be a musician or a music teacher professionally.
What was it like in university chorus and all the other ones you mentioned?
University chorus was great because it's like just this huge group of people, and it's all people who aren't music majors. They're like people who like to sing, or at least this was the case when I was there. They were people who like to sing, people like percussion majors who have to do an ensemble that's not percussion, and it's like the low bar, right? Like I could go sit in the back and sing. So, you know, it was great because the stakes weren't very high. With that, no audition, you just show up. I'm an alto, sit over there. But for me, coming from a small high school that had small groups, being together with such a huge group of musicians and being able to sing stuff and make music with people in that way was just an amazing experience to have. My freshman year, they actually brought in, I think, the director of the Chicago Symphony Chorus to come down and work with the combined Ball State choirs to do part of Mozart's Requiem, which was amazing. You know, that's not an experience I ever thought would have expected to have when I was, you know, in my little high school choir. And then I played in I believe it was the concert band. It was, again, you had to audition, but it was like whatever the lowest one was. And that was fun too, because a lot of the students in it were either people like me who just had been musicians and wanted to keep doing it, or they were music majors on second or third instruments. So you get somebody who's like, you know, plays the clarinet as a major, but they come in and be like on the saxophone or whatever because they had to have that additional experience. There's a lot of music education students who had to pick up more than one instrument and that kind of thing. But again, having the chance to play with an ensemble that actually had all the sections that bands are supposed to have. I mean, one year in high school, we had one trumpet player. That was our brass section, one trumpet player, you can imagine. So to be in like a band that had French horns was amazing to me. It was great. So I just did it because it was fun, you know, more than anything.
That's how our band was too. We had like 3 or 4 maybe if we were lucky.
I think one year we had a trombonist. It's like
That was a rarity, yeah.
yeah. We were not winning any like marching band awards with those, no.
Could you still play the flute today if you pulled it out?
My son, who's my oldest son, who's 9, well, he'll be 10 this year. I shocked him a couple of years ago by actually pulling it out and being able to play it. I would not be very good. It's been a number of years since I played it with any regularity. But I still have the flutes. I have more than one. And I can look at the sheet music and go, wow, I used to be pretty good once. Yeah.
What were your history classes like? What drew you to history?
The great thing about the history minor is it was so vague. So it was, and by vague, I mean, you know, take some classes that are American and take some classes that are not American. Done, right? I think they had a couple of classes that everybody had to take, and then it was pretty much like fill in with the electives. So I could take classes that weren't really in any order, that were things that I was interested in. So I took a Latin American history class. Makes a lot of sense since I was a Spanish minor. It's useful. And I took a class on Tudor and Stuart Britain. It was like a 400 level history class. I don't think I'd had any other British history classes except for the history of Oxford. And that was kind of mind-blowing because the guy who taught it was a military historian, so there's a lot of military stuff that was kind of over my head. But I could take very specific classes that appealed to interests of mine and didn't have to really put them together in like a coherent sequence. So, yeah, but they were all small. I didn't have a TA reading books and talking about them and talking about ideas, and that was really great.
And kind of in your minors and in your major, was there any professors that stuck out to you as well?
I mentioned Matt Fisher already. He's an English professor. His classes were always really fun. He always gave the impression, he's not one of those people who came in with like a lesson plan or a lecture. I'm sure he had a lesson plan. Having taught college, I know he had a lesson plan. But he didn't come in and have a lecture. Right? And he didn't really just come in and start writing stuff. He'd like come in and be, hey, so we read this thing, what'd you think? And we'd start talking. And he, of course, would pick up on ideas and go from there. I know that he had an idea of what we should be talking about, but he was very much discussion oriented and wanted students to lead the thought there. He wasn't going to lead you to it. He wanted you to get there. And he was just really conversational and really fun in that way. And it really influenced the way that I thought about being in the classroom when I came to be in the classroom. I was like, well, I want to be more like Matt than like somebody with the notes and all that kind of thing. I learned a lot from my Latin American history class. I think that was Dr. Alves, maybe. Is he still here? I don't remember. Great, really, I didn't know practically anything about the history of Latin America. I knew very little about the history of Latin America, so that really, again, changed my worldview and how I thought about colonization, let's be honest, how I thought about colonization. I mentioned the Drs. Edmonds. My thesis advisor was a professor in the Spanish department, Dr. Gunche, and she was from Argentina, I believe. And she was one of the co-professors in the Latin American women's literature colloquium that I had taken. And I had also taken a couple of other Spanish classes with her, one of which I did very well in, the other one I got a C in. Because it was a Spanish conversation class and it was at like 9 o'clock in the morning and it was January and it was just a bad decision on my part to do that scheduling. I passed. That was enough. And she was very encouraging and very patient because my Spanish skills were not that great, and despite the minor, and here I am trying to do an honors thesis that involves literary translation. So more than anything, I appreciated her patience and her genuine interest in the subject, which is why I wanted to work with her in the first place. So those are a few, and I mentioned Dr. Ranieri too. Those are a few that stand out.
What all did you do for your honors thesis?
My honors thesis, which I've learned lives on somewhere through the library. You should keep that in mind as you're working on yours. It was translations of a poet whose name is Rosario Castellanos. She's Mexican. And I put together basically just a series of translations of her work from Spanish to English, and I wrote a critical introduction kind of about her and some probably very bad literary criticism of her. Yeah. So it was great because it combined my English major and my Spanish minor. And it also, I was a very bad poet. Maybe creative writing was one of my other 4 minors. Maybe it was creative writing. I forget now. So it combined my interest in poetry too. So it brought together almost as many of my different interests into one project as I could manage. I couldn't fit music in there, but.
Do you have a fellowship while you were in the honors college?
I did, yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
My fellowship was actually for editing the Honors College Literary Magazine. I did that 1 year, The Odyssey. Is it still called that? Do they still have it? Okay. Yeah. So basically, I was in charge of the committee that selected the pieces for the journal, and then I was in charge of seeing the production through. We were still working at the time with the Ball State printing department or whoever. I think at one point they were having the students would actually lay out the thing, but the year that I did it, somebody like the Ball State staff did it. We just kind of approved it. We had a meeting about fonts or something, and then we went from there. So that was my fellowship.
Was that a tough process, or was that difficult?
Not really. I mean, we had kind of figuring out the schedule was the hardest part. So when do you have to have the submissions in by, and when do you need to make decisions by, and when do you have to have them to the printer by, and all that kind of stuff. But practically speaking, and trying to figure out a time when everybody in the committee can get together, it wasn't too difficult. It was just more the responsibility of that.
Did you ever write for it either?
I did. I can't remember if I actually had anything in it the year that I edited it. The submissions process was blind. I should point that out. I didn't pick my own stuff, but I had some things in it in other years. Yeah.
Okay. I think you had a few in '98 that I found.
Ugh.
That were.
I'm sorry.
No, you're okay.
I'm sorry. That was probably the year I edited it, I think. Yeah. I was a poet.
Did you have any other jobs while you were on campus?
I did. I worked a lot. I worked for the writing center in the English department for a number of years, so I worked as a writing tutor. Primarily, I worked for the Center for International Programs. So the semester after I got back, so spring of '95, the first time after I got back, the Center for International Programs was hiring student study abroad assistants. And basically you go around and you give presentations to classes who'd requested them about studying abroad. So we had a spiel, we go out to classes and do that, and we'd answer questions. And then we had at the time a resource center in the center, and brochure back again when nothing was on the internet. It was all brochures and forums and things like that. And so students would come in, to the office, and one of us would usually be staffing the room so that if anybody had questions or was looking for something specific, we could help them with that. So basically we helped with study abroad promotional efforts, a little bit with orientation for students who were going overseas. We did a study abroad fair. That was probably the big thing we did every year. And I did that from the spring of '95 all the way until I graduated. So that was it was a lot of fun. But it's also something I felt really strongly about, how I had such a great experience and such a valuable experience that I wanted to share that with people. There is a video, I don't know if you've seen it, I'm sure they've got it somewhere. They had us do a promotional video. And they used to, like, you know, they had the TVs in every classroom where you could like order the video and have it shown, and we'd cue it up and we'd play it at the beginning of our presentation. So there's your homework, go find it.
Did you act in that too?
I am interviewed in that, yes, exactly, talking about my study abroad experience. So,
and then as you moved towards graduation, what was going on in your mind? Were you looking at the job market? Were you trying to find a job?
Well, an English major with four minors that don't really work together. At some point it became assumed that I was going to go to graduate school. I don't know how much of that was from me and how much of that was me taking in what I thought were other people's assumptions or thoughts about what I should do with my life. I mean, when I came to Ball State, initially I thought I would be an English education major, that I would be an English teacher. It took me a matter of weeks to realize I did not, A, want to teach high school, and B, I didn't want to spend time in education classes. I wanted to spend time in English classes or history classes or music classes. So then I thought, well, I still really like teaching, so maybe I'll be an English professor. And my English professors kind of liked that idea. Right, cool. She's smart, she'd be a good teacher. So, but I did go through a period where, because I loved history so much, because I'd taken Dr. Doyle's public history class, I think it was probably while I was kind of in that whole process, I had thought, well, I really like old things and old stuff, and they have these, you know, they have graduate programs in historic preservation and public history, and I thought really seriously about doing that as well. Dr. Meyer told me I shouldn't do it. I don't think he had a reason more than he thought I should probably be an English professor is probably his reason. And this was back when, again, the internet wasn't really a thing yet. So like you had to go to the library and look stuff up on microfiche, if you can believe that. They had college catalogs on microfiche. You'd be in the film readers looking at college programs, you know, to figure out where to go. And I think colleges had just started to have a web presence, so like I could go to their web page and they would tell me who to write to get the application, right, sent to you in the mail or whatever. It's funny how things changed so quickly in just a few years there by the time I left grad school. So at some point I decided, well, I will go to graduate school. In retrospect, I would go back and tell myself to at least take a year off before, But I was looking at programs in English. I was looking at programs in comparative literature, again, because I've always kind of been an interdisciplinarian who tries to make everything fit together. And I applied to a number of graduate programs, comparative literature, but the only ones I got into were English programs. So sad, too bad. And I ended up choosing the University of Illinois, which lots of folks were excited about. I was sort of excited about it because it was a top 20 graduate program in English. And for me, it was great because it was close to home. I was feeling much more confident about being at the University of Illinois than I had been when I was 17. So that's where I ended up. Yeah.
Then you graduated in the spring of '98.
Yes, from Ball State. Yeah.
With honors.
Yes.
Were you proud of that accomplishment?
I was. Yeah. I remember hoping, I was like, if that C in Spanish conversation, you know, like affects my GPA enough, I'm going to be super annoyed at myself. But no, I was proud of it. And, you know, I received the Provost Prize that year. Again, I don't know if that's something they still do. But it's an award that's given out by a committee of faculty, honors faculty, and students. I had been on a committee a couple of years, I think, before. They don't let the seniors be on that committee. And so it's chosen, I think maybe you have to be nominated. I don't remember now. I don't remember all the technical details, but it was a pretty prestigious thing to receive. And I remember that my grandma had come all the way from Florida. She did not travel. She came, the next time she came north, I think, was when I got married, and that was many years later. She came up from Florida and was there for that, the awards banquet or whatever, and she was really proud. So that made me think, well, okay, that's a big deal. I should be proud too. Yeah.
Looking back on it all now, are you happy about your time at Ball State?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Definitely. And I think it's funny because I'm not from Indiana, but I've now lived here almost longer than I lived in Illinois. And it's so interesting to me to hear people who are from Indiana, the way that they talk about Ball State, like compared to IU or to Purdue or whatever. It's definitely kind of the redheaded stepchild of state universities.
Do you feel that's warranted?
I understand why it is that way, like it doesn't have sports and it doesn't have engineers. But I feel like the education that I got here was really great. And I grew so much as a person here, and I was able to do things here that I may not have been able to do had I gone to, say, a Big Ten school, either because of its size or just because of the limitations. I don't know that I could go have 4 minors, right? And take flute lessons and be a bad poet and that kind of thing, to the extent that I could do here. So I feel like it gives you the opportunity to be both broad and deep if that's what you want to do. And I think having small classes, the way that they have them, is so important. And you're definitely not going to get that at bigger schools. So, big enough to offer lots of great opportunities, I think, but small enough so you don't feel like you're a number being shuffled through a system. Yeah.
Do you think the honors program really helped you feel that way?
I do. I mean, it kind of gave you some place to go, and the way that they have students do colloquium classes, and they kind of they enforce you through curriculum to get together, in very specific ways, so that you have a home, and that's nice because I think too, once you get into a major, you tend to only hang out with people who are in your major, right? But then you have to take these honors classes, and they're not always going to be people that you see every day in English class or whatever. So it kind of forces you to interact with people that you might not otherwise interact with.
And then personally, you feel like it was a good thing for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I got to go to England twice. That was great. It got me into grad school. That was great. And I made some really great friends. I was sad to leave Muncie. People always like, sad to leave Muncie. I was. It was just it was a good place to be. And there's a lot of people and things that I really cared about.
And then once you moved back to Illinois and into grad school, where did you go to grad school?
I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana. And I was in it's one of those where they enroll you as a master's student, but the intent is to go through your PhD. But you have to jump through the master's degree hoop first. I jumped through it. I didn't get all the way through the rest of it. I jumped through it, and then I left after a while. And that was an adjustment, not just because it's a different school in a different place, but because it was just such a much bigger department. Really, really huge, both in terms of undergrad students and just in the number of graduate students that they had. So it took quite a while to kind of feel like I was home there. It's going to be a transition anyway, but it was just such a different environment from Ball State that it was a little bit jarring at first.
What was your time there like, schedule-wise and class-wise?
One of the reasons, if I could go back and do it over again, is tell myself to take a year off was because I was not really great about scheduling my time. As an undergraduate, I was able to be, because I was working, because I was doing all these other things, your time can get pretty regimented, right? And that can help you stay organized and helps you stay focused to an extent. And then when you get to graduate school, you're like, well, I have these classes that only meet once a week. And then, okay, because they think I can teach a class, they've put me in a classroom to teach a class, and that's bewildering and weird, and that meets, 2 or 3 times a week. But then you have all of this unscheduled time when you have to pretty quickly figure out what to do with yourself and to stay on top of what you're learning and what you're supposed to be doing. They weren't always clear about what expectations, I guess, in that way. It's like they were there, but you didn't always understand exactly what they were, so there was a little bit of floundering going on. So certainly there was an adjustment as I tried to figure out, how am I going to do this? It's different. How am I going to figure it out?
What did you have to teach?
I taught business and technical writing. If you can imagine, I'm 22 years old, and the business and technical writing class was taught to juniors and seniors. So like people who are like a year younger than me, maybe, or my age, right? And I remember when I got my TA assignment in the mail the summer before graduate school started, I was like, what are you thinking? I don't know anything about business writing. What are you thinking? Most incoming, graduate students got a composition class, right? I was like, okay, I think I can handle that. No, business and technical writing. And their theory, I know, was because I'd spent so much time working at the Writers Center, the Writing Center in the English department, that I had a lot of teaching experience. No. So I literally was like on vacation the month before the semester started reading the business and technical writing textbook. It was terrible. Like I said, I would really like to go back and apologize to them because it was not... I was completely petrified most of the time, and I felt like, okay, I just need to stay like a week ahead of them. If I can stay a week ahead of them. And I do have a bachelor's degree. I've actually graduated. They have not. So at least there's that. It got a lot better, but that first semester was crazy. And if I ran English graduate departments in the world, I would say you should never put a first-year grad student in front and as a TA in front of a class, because to call us a TA was also kind of a misnomer. I taught the class. They chose the textbook for me because I was new, but like I wrote all the assignments, I made up the schedule, everything was all me. I had a little bit of support, who was another graduate student. It wasn't even a professor. And they had us in a class that was supposed to be about teaching, but it was just all theory, critical stuff, and not really, what do I do when the student is mad at me, that kind of thing. It was not a positive experience, and I don't think they should do that to people. I feel very strongly about that. But ultimately, teaching was kind of why I had gone to grad school. So once you get through that first shock, and you get a little bit more familiarity and confidence under your belt, it became a very good experience.
And then you got your master's in 2001?
Yes.
And then after that, did you start on your PhD track?
Yeah, it's the kind of master's degree they give you when you've done all the stuff you're supposed to do, but there was no like, ding, you've graduated, congratulations. It was like, okay, we're going to send you this in the mail. And they sent me like a laminated wallet card too. So I have like the actual, and I don't know, I'm a master of arts. Look at me. I don't understand what that was for. But so it was kind of, on the one hand, yes, I did everything for the master's degree. I graduated in 2001. On the other hand, I was still taking coursework toward a PhD. So it felt kind of like a concession. It was like, oh, you're done with that now, whatever, just keep moving on. So I was taking some coursework toward the PhD, but I was really burned out and starting to question exactly what I was doing and why I was there. And I was at that point in the program where you have to pick, a dissertation advisor, and you've got to start thinking further down the road about what you want to specialize in and what your projects would be. And we had some changes in faculty there that meant some of the people I wanted to work with got jobs at other schools. And it was like, well, I don't know this faculty member well. I don't really want to sign on with them for 5 more years if I don't really know them. So it was a transitional period for the program and a transitional period for me. And I thought, I need to just take some time and figure out what I'm doing and what I want to be doing. And so I did a year where I just taught as a non-tenure track faculty member. So I wasn't actually a student. It was kind of like I took a leave and spent a year teaching. And by the end of that year, I was like, I don't think I want to go back and finish this. It felt like I could be overeducated and underemployed with a master's degree. Honestly, there was a lot of negative things happening in higher education, staffing, all of which is still happening. It hasn't changed in 20 years. That meant, you could go through and do this PhD and work really hard and have this accomplishment, and then you wouldn't get a job. Or you'd get a job that, paid you $24,000 a year, and you'd be 30-some years old, no retirement account, nothing. It's like, you know what? I don't think I want to live that way. And it was really hard for me because I'd always kind of seen myself as a teacher, and so it was like, well, now what am I going to do?
Looking back, do you still think that was the right decision?
I think it was the right decision at the time. I struggled a long time with it even afterward. It's kind of like I had PTSD. I couldn't read like a novel for at least a couple of years because I couldn't read it as like a story. It was like you couldn't shut off the kind of critical part of the graduate part of your brain. But for a long time, it felt like a failure rather than a choice, if that makes sense. Like I had to leave because I couldn't handle it. In retrospect now, I don't think that was the case. I probably needed some time off. I think I did need some time off, but it's not that I wasn't a capable person or a capable scholar, that I couldn't have completed that process. But there's just like a lot of guilt and loathing tied up into leaving those kinds of programs. And I don't know how much of that was just the competitive environment and how much of it was self-inflicted. I don't know. But I do think it was the right choice. Yeah.
And when did you end up leaving?
I left in 2002. Yeah, so it was a year after I technically finished my master's degree. Yeah.
What was your plan after that?
My plan was to get a real job. I had no plan. I thought surely I could be an editor because after all, I had graded lots of student papers. That seemed reasonable. Man. And I was fortunate to find somebody who thought that maybe I could be made into an editor. They were willing to work with me to do that. So I got a job in Indianapolis. And, the thing about going to Ball State too is that I fell in with a bunch of friends who had either like grown up in Muncie or grown up in Indianapolis. And they didn't really go anywhere. Most of them didn't really go anywhere once they graduated. So it's like, oh, I can go to Indianapolis and then my friends are there. Or I can move back home with my parents in Chicago. And I was like 25 that seemed like, no, I don't want to do that. So I got a job in Indianapolis with an educational publisher and was super fortunate to work with people who actually wanted to train me and really make me an editor. And then I've just been doing that kind of thing ever since.
What did you do at that place?
They were they're not in business any longer. There's reasons for that. They produced study guide publications for people who are going to take I don't know if you're familiar with CLEP exams. They're like subject proficiency exams. So you can be like, okay, I'm going to go take this exam in American literature or whatever. And if you pass the test, universities at the time, I don't know if they still do this, will give you like 3 hours of college credit. Like, oh, you've learned everything you would learn in that class anyway. So congratulations, here's your 3 credit hours. So this company produced a bunch of these study guides for people who are going to take these exams because particularly before online learning was really a thing, there were programs that would help people get college credit faster by saying, oh, just take a bunch of these tests, test out all that general education stuff you don't need anyway. And then, we'll get you into a nursing program or, something like that, most of which was still done kind of by correspondence. It was a business model that was quickly becoming obsolete, we'll say. They were basically an educational publisher, but they didn't do like textbooks in the way that we think of them.
What was your role?
I was just an editor with those, yeah.
Just for study guides or?
Yeah, that's pretty much all we did. We did do some custom textbook work for schools, universities, but that was pretty much all we did.
How long were you there?
Just a little over 2 years. I got bored pretty quickly, but I could also see that this was not a business model that was going to be around for a while. So it was like, well, they pay me pretty well, but I think I need to go do something else because pretty soon I probably won't have a job at all. So I should be proactive about that. And it just so happened that the Indiana Historical Society Press was hiring for an assistant editor. And I was like, that is me. History and editing, perfect. Sign me up. And fortunately, they felt the same way. So I started working for them in 2004.
What was that like?
Oh my gosh, it was great. It was like being with my people. I started out working with Ray Boomhauer as the assistant editor for Traces magazine, which is their quarterly membership magazine. It's basically a trade popular history kind of thing that focuses on Indiana and Midwestern history. So I worked with Ray on that. Ray is also very interested in biographies. He writes them and edits them. And so we had an Indiana biography series at the time that I edited. So I worked on biographies of James Dean, for example, Meredith Nicholson, who's an Indiana author. And we had a children's biography series also that I worked with. So it was great for me because I got some magazine experience and some book experience. And it was a fairly small staff at the time. So we all got to work together on various things.
And that was all editing?
Yep. Yeah.
Did you do anything else besides editing while you were there for the fun of it?
History is fun. What are you talking about?
That's true.
I was fortunate while I was there just to have some really great mentors. Like we just had a lot of fun at work. And I continued to work with and for them really up until last year, although a bunch of the way that the organization has changed and since 2004 means that I was laid off at one point because they cut the staff, and then I came back part-time to do some work with their family history, specifically the family history publications. And then I worked with them just as a contractor for a long time too on a whole bunch of stuff. But it was working with them that's led me to where I am today. Not just in terms of like editing skill, but like what I actually do today is in large part because I've worked with them for so long.
Remember when you were laid off?
Yeah, it was terrible.
You know what year that was?
2006.
Were you
Halloween.
Ooh, that is scary.
It was scary, yeah.
Remember what that was like? Were you scared to look for another job, or?
The primary thing I remember is that, they take you into the conference room and they're like, here's your folder with the severance. We feel really bad. And then I can't say I was surprised because we got a new CEO and were some financial challenges with the institution and its endowment, and it was clear that they were going to have to make some staffing changes. But they had the vice president for the press had already resigned, and the staff had kind of felt like, well, that's the big thing, right? And the fact that they came in and then cut our staff even more to a level from which it's never recovered. It's like every year they still have fewer people over there. It was a surprise. It was a surprise. But they give you the folder and the tissues and whatever, and then they put you in this room with this like I guess career counselor. I don't know, because I'm supposed to be thinking about that immediately after I get laid off. And she had looked at my resume, and the first thing she said to me was, well, why don't you think about getting certified to teach high school? I just looked at her. I was like, you are going to be extremely unhelpful in this whole process. You're not helpful at all. So yeah, I was worried. But I also had been teaching as an adjunct at Ivy Tech in the English department there. And in fact, before I got the job with IHS, I had applied to be a full-time faculty member at Ivy Tech. I thought, well, this educational publishing thing, not too great, but hey, Ivy Tech is hiring, full-time faculty. I'm qualified to do that. And I was a finalist for that position initially, and I pulled out to take the IHS job instead. So I went to my department chair at Ivy Tech and said, hey, I just got laid off. Can you give me more work? And she's like, yes, I can give you more work. So this was before Obamacare passed, so I could teach 5 or 6 classes a semester and make a reasonable living. I couldn't have supported myself on my own. But with my husband, I was married at that time, we were able to make it work. That eventually became not sustainable either. But the press brought me back in a part-time position in the spring of 2007. That's when I started working with family history publications. And then I had to leave that after my oldest son was born because, $13 an hour doesn't pay for daycare. So that's when I began my freelance career. Yeah.
So you met your husband around this time?
I met him in 2003. It was like the year after I moved to Indianapolis. Yeah.
What was his name?
Eric. Yeah.
And what were you guys like?
We met online. I can imagine that back when that was just starting to be a thing. And he grew up here. He grew up in Westfield and Carmel. So, he was from here and his family was here. So that's why we're still here. If you had told me when I moved here in 2002, I would still be in Indiana today, I would have said you were crazy because I was just going to go stop here for a while and then go on to something else. But then, yeah, I met my husband and then we were married in 2005. So before I got laid off in the first place.
What does he do?
He works for, it used to be Tyco. It's now Johnson Controls. He is I'm not exactly sure what he does. He's like a project coordinator, manager person. They're a commercial security and access control firm. So they make the locks through your doors and your fire alarm systems and service and install those. And so he right now is working with national resales and stuff. So he's worked for them pretty much since he got out of college. Another English major, doing very English major things. Yeah.
When you went back for part-time at IHS, was that still a good experience?
Yeah, because I love the people that I worked with. It was weird because I was hideously underpaid, let's be honest. And the whole situation there was still felt very weird after all the staff changes. And they had a new CEO and were trying to figure out what kind of institution they were going to be because that changed very significantly during that period. They went to more of a museum interactive model than here we are a building with a library that has a lot of old papers in it. And occasionally we do stuff and publish things. So it was a really transitional period for the institution, and it was both good and interesting to be part of that, and to see people that I had a lot of respect for sort of really struggle with making that adjustment.
What was it like going back and forth between the IHS and your job at Ivy Tech?
Oh, it was not a big deal. I pretty much started teaching online at Ivy Tech about this time. I think I only had a couple of semesters where I was full-time, like in a classroom all the time. They started their online classes program, I think in 2007 is when I started teaching there. And I pretty quickly went to all online classes for them. So,
did you enjoy that?
Yes and no. The thing about the way that Ivy Tech, the institution, is put together, they want to make sure that the classes that you take from South Bend are the same as the classes you take from Indianapolis, are the same as the ones you take from Evansville. So with the online classes in particular, because you can get students taking a class in Indianapolis, but they live in Fort Wayne or whatever. They really standardize the curriculum, which means, same book, same assignments, somebody writes it for you and you deliver it. So it's a very different experience from a teacher perspective. It wasn't that way initially. I was actually very involved in designing courses regionally, both the technical writing class that they used to have and some of the world literature classes. Technical writing turned out to be a good thing eventually. It's just that first year that I was not happy about it. But once they standardized stuff across the state, and then they also, Obamacare passed and they had to put restrictions on how much their adjuncts could work, right? They wouldn't have to pay for their insurance and all that stuff. It meant that I pretty quickly became just a delivery person and a grading person. And that's not why I became a teacher, Yeah.
Did you felt constrained then?
Oh yeah, eventually. Well, then I was just really burned out by the time I quit doing that last year. So it's been almost 20 years that I've been teaching, and I was kind of like, yeah, I think I've done what there is to do. Did
you do any freelance work during your time?
I did. Yeah. I worked as a freelance editor and a writer also. So I had mostly in family history. So I've had some articles published in family history journals. I worked primarily with little publishers and some private individuals doing like memoirs and biography and local history stuff, a very narrow interest.
When did you said you left Ivy Tech in 2018?
Yes.
When did you leave IHS?
2018. So I was working as a contractor. At some point, they wanted to start an ebook program. I forget exactly how long ago this is now. And they were like, we don't have time to do it, but you know stuff about ebooks. I was like, not really, but I can learn. So I got trained for and then ran their ebook publishing program, their digital publishing program for a number of years. But that whole time I was a contractor. So was great when I had young kids and I could set my own schedule, and they were, they had to be flexible with me. But in terms of the work I was doing, that really hadn't changed at all, no matter what my employment status was. But at some point, the uncertainty of being a freelancer and someone who relies on contract work gets to be a lot, especially when you got little kids.
When were your kids born?
My oldest was born in 2009, and my youngest was in 2013. So they're almost 10. He'll be 10 in June, and then the younger one's 5.5, almost 5.5.
And what are their names?
Math is hard. The oldest one, his name is August, and the youngest is Ari.
Do they go to school in Indy then?
They do. Well, the youngest one's he's in preschool. Okay. He'll start kindergarten in the fall. Yeah, my oldest he's at the IPS Butler University Lab School in Indianapolis. Yeah.
Okay. And then once you moved out of those two jobs, what did you look into to find something more stable?
So many jobs here and here and there. Last year when I was thinking, it's probably time to make a change here. I've been working as a freelancer and a contractor and cobbling together things with that in Ivy Tech for over 10 years. I've been doing all of that. My kids were getting older. The youngest one's going to be in kindergarten. It was like, there's an opportunity here to do something else, and I really need to be doing something else. Well, my current company was advertising an open editorial position last winter, and I looked at the job description and I thought, this is my job. This is it. This is it. They are a family history research company based in Salt Lake City. So most of its employees are remote. We don't have a corporate headquarters office. We all work from home. And it was a full-time job, editing, working with family history from home with benefits and retirement and stuff. And I thought, that's it. And fortunately, they thought the same thing about me. So I started working for them it's been almost exactly a year. It was March of 2018. Yeah.
And what exactly do you do for them? You just edit?
I am the editing team lead. The company's name is Legacy Tree Genealogists. The editing team lead, that's a fancy way to say that I run the editing department, but there's only 4 of us, so it's not a very big department. But yeah, We primarily edit client reports and products. So clients say, I want you to hire, to research my family history. Grandpa was supposed to be related to Daniel Boone or whatever they have. And so they hire our company. We have researchers who do the work, and then they produce a report and some accompanying product stuff. And then all that comes through the editorial department, both to make sure that it's all right in terms of grammar and spelling and all that kind of thing, but also kind of as a peer review for the research. So we're looking at, the names and dates and places and the evidence to support the conclusions that are being made and all that good critical thinking kind of work to make sure that we haven't made a terrible mistake somewhere and misidentified somebody's ancestor or whatever. So we're both kind of peer review and traditional editorial.
Are you enjoying that job so far?
I love it. The problem has been finding the extra 10 hours in the week when, to go to like actual 40-hour-a-week employment. That's been a little bit of a challenge. I can do 30 hours a week pretty easily, but getting to 40 has been a little harder. But it reminds me in some ways of working for the Historical Society, because everybody is just really thoughtful and engaged and smart and interested in problem solving. As colleagues, they're really great, and I feel very fortunate to have found another group of people like that to work with, like I had at IHS.
Are you part of any organizations?
I do continue to work with IHS. I'm their board of trustees has a family history advisory board that I was asked to be part of last year. So we meet quarterly to talk about programming and other sorts of things that the society does related to family history. I'm involved to some degree still with the Indiana Genealogical Society, although not as much as I have been in the past. And it's about all I have time for, to be honest. I tend to stay involved with the professional organizations for me now are those in family history and genealogy. Yeah.
Looking back from where you are now, when you first came to Ball State, did you have any idea you'd be something like this today?
No. I guess the editor part doesn't really surprise me. Still living in Indiana surprises me a little bit. I thought, when I was 18 or 19 that I'd go do what were in my mind much more interesting things. No offense to Indiana. Obviously, I think it's still pretty good, or I wouldn't still be here. But I don't think if you had told me I would be working in family history and genealogy that I would have believed you, because although it had always been something I was interested in as growing up, like, who makes money in that, right? Like, that's not... I will never forget this about Dr. Doyle's class. He had us do, and I don't know if he still does this, he has you write a paper about like some career in public history. And I was like, I'm going to write about being a genealogist. And I'll never forget, because he wrote something on my paper. He was like, when I first started reading this, I did not believe that you were going to be able to convince me that this would be like legitimate. Right. But I was able to convince him that it would be legitimate. And then here I am today, 20 years later, actually working in that. Maybe I knew more than I thought I did in his class. But yeah, I wouldn't have anticipated it, when I first started at Ball State, for sure.
Are you still happy where you ended up?
I think so. Not everybody gets to do what they love. I miss teaching. I don't miss grading. I miss like the teaching. But there's enough about my current job that involves kind of that problem solution stuff that teaching involves. So figuring out what needs are and how you can address them. And we do quite a bit of training with our employees that I've been involved in. So it kind of scratches that itch a little bit too. It's brought together both kind of my skill set and my interests in a way that I wouldn't have anticipated, but that seems to be where I'm supposed to be.
And then your kids are still pretty young.
Yeah, they are.
But once they get that age, are you going to push them to go to college and pursue their careers?
It's funny, because my 5-year-old this morning was like, "You mean there's college? Like, I have to go to there's high school, and then I have to go to." I was like, "Well, you don't have to go to college. We're going to really encourage you to go, but you don't have to, And my oldest was like, "You went to Ball State?" we've driven through campus and I pointed at buildings. So I think he's seeing that in a different way today maybe than he had just a few years ago. So he kind of wants to go to Butler, I think, because his school's associated with Butler. It's like, man, you get working on that scholarship aspect. I know you're only 9, but I certainly would. I've always encouraged people to think about Ball State. My experience was just so positive from beginning to end, and with the Honors College, having that is such a great benefit. And the kinds of opportunities it offers its students. My husband's an IU grad, and I think we'll probably have to fight it out when it comes down to it. But I definitely encourage that.
You think Ball State's still a great place to go today?
That sounds like a question you should answer. I think so. It's funny driving down McKinley here because it's so different now. I was like, oh, that building wasn't there, and that's a parking garage? When did that happen? The physical environment is very different, and so much of that has happened comparatively recently, really. But it's great that they've got those kind of facilities now because they can do so much more, I think, for students. And I've never really heard anybody say anything negative about Ball State. Not specifically like, oh, well, it's not IU. Well, what does that even mean, right? So.
You still think it has that smaller school but not big school atmosphere?
I hope it does.
You feel like that was important for you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Is there anything we've not talked about today that you'd like to bring up? Whether it be your career or your college time?
I don't know. I feel like we've got most of it.
Whether it be professor or a story or anything you'd like to share?
I was telling my husband on the way over, I was like, boy, I hope I can make, wrote bad poetry and dated musicians sound interesting. My college experience. I don't know. I think we've hit all of it. All the things that I was thinking about were important. My study abroad experience, the honors coursework, all that sort of stuff. And I think generally just the encouragement I got from professors. I always felt like I could approach them, whether they were strictly an honors professor or not. I always felt like they would listen, and part of that I think comes from the fact that classes are small and you get to know each other in a way across the semester that you don't if you're sitting in a lecture of 100 or 300 people. That kind of personal connection I think was really important, and it's something when I think about my time at Ball State that I really value. So I hope that that's still important here. I hope that hasn't changed.
All right. So with that, we'll bring our interview to an end. On behalf of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, I want to thank you, Rachel, for participating in our project.
Thanks.